Hi, and welcome to RBP on JSB. I'm violinist Rachel Barton Pine, and today we're going to be talking about the first movement of Bach's Partita No. 2 in D minor, the Allemanda. By the way, if you want to hear about some of the issues that pertain to all of the Bach sonatas and partitas, please be sure to watch the overview episode. So, the Allemande courant sarabande jig was the standard set of four dances that was very common and popular in the Baroque era. And in fact, if you look at the only cycle of multi-movement works for unaccompanied violin prior to Bach's Six Sonatas and Partitas, the Six Suites by Johann Paul Westhoff, every single one of them is exactly an Allemande courant sarabande jig, the good old ACSG. But of course, in this case, it turns out that that set of four movements is ultimately leading up to the grand chaconne. This Allemande is often the very first movement of the unaccompanied Bach works that a young violinist embarks upon, and indeed that was the case for me. I think I first learned it when I was around 8 years old. Of course, had no idea what I was doing, and played it slowly in the third position, kind of the old-fashioned way. And actually, it's tempting to want to play it in the third position because you get that nice darkness. And to do the opening pickup, of course, on the G string. But experiment with keeping more of it in the first position than you might be inclined to do. That is, if you're looking for sort of Baroque influenced approach to your interpretation, because it wasn't that they were, not good enough to shift around. I mean, look at Locatelli going all the way up to the, basically off the fingerboard in the early 1700s. I mean, people could play the violin, but they liked the variety, the complexity, that's a better word, the complexity of going across the different strings. This idea of homogeneity being a preferable sound actually didn't really enter into our consciousness until the 19th and even the 20th century when it became very predominant. So starting in the first position, it might make more sense to have the opening pickup be the open string. You get that wonderful ring, and it's leading towards the upper voice. And then the G string is coming in special, and which also makes it kind of blend with the next G string note. Aha, so we have a logical reason for this. So then just that one lower note goes all the way to there, and if you play all these notes on the G string, then it obscures this specialness being connected to this specialness. And of course, harmonically speaking, I think we want to start this movement very boldly because it's opening this whole journey which culminates in the chaconne, and somehow the fact that we are starting down that path, we want to do it with, be very emphatic about it. But don't give in to temptation, because this is just the tonic. The tonic is not the most intense thing. It's this diminished chord halfway through the bar that has your intensity. So start, medium, and go to here, and give the measure some shape. Interestingly, that going to the half bar thing is exactly the phrase shape of the first bar of the other Allemande in B minor. Going to that half bar moment with the intense chord. Tempo. What should the tempo be? It is in 4/4, not in cut time. However, it's definitely not in 8/8. So you don't want to play it so slow that it sounds like it's in 8/8. Maybe you like this very contemplative approach and finding deep meaning in every note and taking your time and playing it super slowly. Well, that is your prerogative, especially because it's unaccompanied. You don't have to get any colleague to agree with you. It's all you. But, we could take any music and make it into something it's not. We could... probably thinking, that's a practice tempo, how ridiculous. Well, you know what? I think the same thing if somebody plays this Allemande really slowly, because it's not a slow movement. You should not play it too fast. It's not just because it's 16ths doesn't mean it's some kind of a perpetual motion, and you shouldn't rush through it. You should give yourself time to absorb all of the detail of what's going on. But, definitely don't make it too lugubrious and into some kind of adagio that it's not. All right, end of rant. Okay, so let's talk about some of the keys. We have two wonderful F major moments. The first one is rather brief, but after the sort of D minor darkness, of the opening 3 bars, it lightens up. Now it's in F major, so make sure that your tone is not as deep, that you have, something just a little bit more pleasant in your sound. And then, of course, it goes back to minor. And lots of wonderful multiple voice stuff going on, even in measure 5s. Bass voice. Right, so there's this kind of dialogue stuff. And would it be more satisfactory to go over to the G string for that? Well, if you're thinking of sort of a romantic approach to the concept of sound, certainly. But if you're thinking more Baroque, you don't need to use string as a crutch. In other words, you can make that into the cello line just by deciding it's the cello line and you're going to do it. And the cellist wouldn't have been playing Sul G the whole time. So therefore, I kind of think it's nice for the shape of the phrase, for it to go from the D to the G, that it's, too much sameness for it to all be on the G. But that's just my opinion. You might like doing it on the G, and I certainly don't blame you. I used to do it on the G for years. Okay, so let's see. We have our other F major section, which is quite a bit longer, and that's in the middle of the second half. So it starts to kind of morph after our G minor cadence. And by the way, when we have our cadence, be sure to take a little bit of time. Give yourself a moment of breathing room. So let's start in measure 21. Okay, and then so that's kind of your transitional measure, measure 22. And you could take time right at the start of it or sort of in the middle of it, at the end of it. There's lots of different timing options, but do something special with it. And now you're going to be F major for just about 4 bars. Actually, a little bit of D minor, but it doesn't last long. B flat major. Resolving back into F major. So it's kind of an F major section with little, forays around it. But in general, I wouldn't make too much of the D minor because it's this overall this multi-measure chance to be a bit lighter before going back to being generally minor. A little bit of B flat major, but not really, etc. So special moment at 23, and do what you like with it. I mean, there's always so many options. Your minor key could be sweet and sad, and your major key could be loud and joyful, or your minor key could be loud and angsty, and your major key could be, sweet and happy. Whatever you're going to do, or they could both be soft, but different kinds of soft, or both be loud, but different kinds of loud. Whatever you're going to do, just make sure that they have clearly defined, distinct characters that aren't the same as each other. One thing that I think is really interesting in this Allemande is that, as opposed to the B minor Allemande, where Bach had tags at the end of both halves. Here he has a cadence in the middle of measure 15 and then a tag. And then, but wait, there's more. And generally tags are a bit lighter. They're like that extra music that kind of gets stuck on the end as a little bonus. And so I wouldn't necessarily come back, even though it's a 4-note chord. A 4-note chord doesn't have to be loud and full, doesn't have to do that. So that just doesn't feel taggish. I would make more of the actual cadence. As a question mark, the 5 chord going back to the D minor or onto the D minor. Ultimately, we get there by bar 2 in the second half. Now, bar 2 does not have a false cadence or a real ending and a tag or any of those things. Whatever. Let's see, that wasn't a good one. Let's see if I can invent a different one. There we go. Okay, wasn't very good, but you get the idea. He could have put a tag like that at the end, but he didn't, which is kind of interesting. I have no idea why. I'd love to ask him. But anyhow, first half has a tag, second half doesn't. There are some thoughts to consider as regards bowing in this movement. First of all, at measure 8, it's very, very common for people to hook. But actually, if you have a Baroque bow in your hand, it's easy enough not to, and much more stylish. Kind of light ups that lift after the up. In fact, just practice that as kind of an exercise. Long, short, lift, long, short, lift, long, short, lift, long. And I actually wouldn't even have all of those beats be the same. I would maybe goo the first and third beat and treat beats 2 and 4 as a little bit of frill at the end of them. Which kind of leads nicely into that one with the 5/16th note worth of a slur, which is even gooier. Because always it's good to phrase by half bars or by whole bars or something like that rather than beat, beat, beat. So you don't want to... Now, I take it all back when we get to measure 11, because here it really is beat, beat, beat. It's a sequence, very different than measure 8. And this is one of those moments that reminds me, we were talking about tempo earlier, an Allemanda is a dance. Actually, interestingly, while people were still dancing things like the giga or the sarabande in 1720, the Allemande was more of an antique dance. It was part of this ACSG set of movements that people loved, but certain of those dances people were still dancing when it came to dance music, and the Allemande, they really weren't anymore. So they were just remembering what an Allemande used to be. Nonetheless, and even though Bach's dances weren't ever going to be choreographed or accompanying real dancing, I think he still wants us to retain the spirit of the dance and doing hooks. Well, you could not dance to that unless you were an elephant. So better to make your bow dance. I love how he has one slur, another slur, so it's half bars and then, so 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 1, 1. It's giving you that built-in momentum based on his bowing pattern. So we saw that at measure 11, the sequence is going down. Interestingly, when he comes back to such a thing at measure 19, He starts low. Well, I guess he goes down again. But somehow the way the harmonies are progressing, it almost sounds like maybe you want to crescendo. So you don't always have to go in a diminuendo just because the pitches are going down. Every once in a while, you might vary from that. It's not a hard and fast rule. It's just a general suggestion that works well most of the time. So because you have this cadence, it kind of makes sense to, go all the way there. Because if you diminuendoed, you could start to crescendo, but then you're climbing down to your F major. So I feel like it wasn't strong enough, long enough before the F major, so that's why I like to crescendo here, and then have this whole bar be big. It just kind of sets it up nicely. Sometimes you have to think like a chess player, 3 moves ahead. I want to do this here, therefore I have to lead up to it doing this here, which means that before that I have to do this so that that will work, etc., working your way backwards as you build your interpretation. All right, another bowing thing that bears mention is the end of measure 21, right where we were. There are 2 slurs on the cadence. Now we have a similar cadence, same exact pattern of notes, slightly different key. Measure 15. And there, Bach does not give you the second slur. Well, very often, Bach would actually write slightly different bowings. There are numerous examples of this, where he varies things ever so slightly, and sometimes very obviously. Like one time he'll write a 3-note slur, 3 notes and a separate note. The next time he'll write 2 and 2. And he's not being inconsistent. He's deliberately giving you variety. Inconsistent sounds like a negative thing, but variety is a positive thing. And so, did he forget a slur in measure 15, or was he deliberately giving you variety? Actually, I added that slur for many years. Can't remember whether I did it on my second recording of this piece recently, or whether but actually, I would consider maybe doing them separately. Yeah, it's really up to you, but something to think about. Don't just automatically assume that he must have made a mistake. And there's also another place that people tend to correct that maybe they should and maybe they shouldn't. End of measure 29, same kind of grouping as the first 2 beats of 30. So it's tempting to start that pattern 1 beat earlier in measure 29. But maybe he didn't want that. Maybe he starts it separate, and then the last 2 he has more emphatically with those slurs, adding weight to them. And then a surprising harmony, so really set that up. Right, so here we have E flat major, and then, kind of an A7 over there. So that really is an interesting sudden chord change, so make sure that that 3rd beat of 30 is set up nicely. All right, the last thing I want to mention about bowing is measure 9. Now, 99.999% of the time, you see people split this slur. And why is that? Do people assume that Bach must have meant for all those notes to sound like a slur, but they couldn't possibly be executed that way in reality? That is certainly true of many, many composers, particularly from later generations. Not so much from the Baroque. In the Baroque, they tended to write more realistically. There are plenty of composers from the 1800s onwards who write unrealistically long slurs that they know can't possibly be done all in one bow on the violin, but they do that because they know that they want you to be thinking of joining all those notes together in a long line, and then you just split it wherever you need to split it physically, but they want you to think that long slur. Totally valid approach, but I don't think Bach did that. If you look through his whole sonatas and partitas, not to mention all of his other compositions for violin, there just aren't enough instances like that for us to think that that was his approach. So I've got to come from a standpoint of maybe this slur is for real. It also lends weight to the argument that this movement shouldn't be played too slowly, because if you are playing it super slowly, then it does become unrealistic. But this long slur, now even at a medium tempo, you can only achieve it if you play pretty softly, because it's a lot of notes to fit into one bow. But you know how Bach writes so few dynamics in his music, but in a way he is writing dynamics. By having certain chord changes, he's telling you that he's changing the volume, changing the intensity. So he doesn't need to, it would almost be redundant to add an F over every time he puts an intense chord, or to add a P under every time he changes from minor key to a nice gentle major key, because it's so obvious. Why should he even bother? And here with this long slur, it's almost like he's telling you that here's a soft moment. The slur itself becomes a dynamic indication. Let's see what I mean by that. So let's start in measure 8. We have to diminuendo to it, or it doesn't make sense. A really magical moment. And then come back to Isn't that cool? It's like this moment of stillness and then so much action when you do the original bowing in measure 11. Somehow, when you, just a lot of the time, when you go back to what Bach actually wrote, it's so much more interesting than not doing it. If I just stayed medium dynamic and hooked this and split this and then had 3 sets of 8 notes under a bow, they'd all kind of sound the same. And sameness is not a virtue. And then hook these. Well, then I'd sound just as kind of boring as I did when I was 8 years old. So that's my 2 cents about all of the bowings in this movement, which can really add just a whole nother level of variety and interest. All right, well, that does it for the D minor Allemanda. I'm Rachel Barton Pine, and thanks for watching RBP on JSB.